Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Jane Smiley, whose latest novel is Lidie, The Further Travels and Adventures of Lidie Newton. If that title rings a bit of a bell, it's because in 1998, Jane published The All True Travels and Adventures of Lidie Newton. That novel, set in the 1850s as our country crept toward a civil war, told of Lidie Harkness of Quincy, Illinois, a young resolute woman who marries an abolitionist and takes up the cause. Surrounded by violence, she goes after a killer in enemy territory, disguising herself as a boy to do so. Now Lidie returns. The country has moved even closer to civil war, and Lidie, a widow and bereft, becomes close to her niece, Annie, an actress. When Annie's career takes off, Lidie, her armed protector, joins her. Thus, more travels, more adventure, and more delight. First published in 1980, Jane has written many novels, 18 I think, several of which are considered among the finest in modern American literature. 1,000 Acres, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1992, Moo, a 5-part satire set largely at a Midwest agricultural college, a trilogy featuring an Iowa farming family that began with some luck, and others of note. Among her non-fiction works is Charles Dickens' A Life. Jane was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and won the Penn USA Lifetime Achievement Award. She was a longtime professor of English at Iowa State University. Jane Smiley, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you.
Jane, how long have you been thinking about writing another novel about Lidie?
Well, when I first started out, I wanted it to be a trilogy. And I had some ideas, but I didn't quite know what they were for volume 2 and 3. But the idea that I had was that Lidie would escape to Europe, and then somehow she would end up taking that train that they had, or maybe still have, I don't know, across Russia. And then the third volume would be about the differences between slavery and serfdom in Russia. But I didn't have any particular ideas about how to do it, except, I thought, oh, well, I could go maybe ride that train.
So going back now, all those years later, was there anything that made you hesitant to pick it up again?
No, I love going back to my previous work and rereading it and then thinking about how I might add something to it. After I wrote, excuse me, the Last 100 Years trilogy, I thought, okay, now I know a little bit more about writing a series rather than just one book. So I went back to Lidie and I thought, okay, what is she going to do? And then I remembered that there was this other person present in her family who was her niece, but is actually only about a year younger than she is, and that was Annie. So I thought, okay, Lidie and Annie need to get together and they need to learn something, or a lot of things, from one another. Lidie, the thing that Lidie might learn from Annie, she didn't know about what Annie's ambitions were, but Lidie thought she might learn from Annie how to do housework, how to be more responsible, how to be more agreeable to her relatives. And so it's quite a surprise to her that Annie wants to be an actress.
One thing you just mentioned, that the age similarity between Annie and Lidie, I have to admit that I was surprised to be reminded of how young Lidie is, because she's already lived a life.
Yes, But when in those days, in the mid 19th century, people had children when they were very young. That was the thing that sort of intrigued me about Lidie's family, that her mother um, and her sister's mother had had so many children, and a lot of them had died before or shortly after birth. I just thought that was an interesting part about life in those days, that what you had to put up with, what you had to understand.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, so I wanted Lidie's family life to reflect what was common in her time of when she was living.
yeah. I want to get back to the thought I mentioned earlier about uh, danger and or hesitation in revisiting a character. Um, a character like Lidie, it doesn't belong to you anymore. And people have a relationship with Lidie that is
Yeah,
different than your relationship with her. Um, and
but
so
that's true of all your relatives,
sure,
So, so I always kind of felt close to Lydia or even identified with her because she has some characteristics that I have, one of which is hating housework, another of which is being tall, and a third is interest in stuff, wanting to explore. And it's to want to do that in our day, that's almost always a pleasure
yes,
because there's so many ways to go places.
yeah,
But in her day, wanting to explore was always dangerous.
yeah,
And so actually, I explored this a little bit also in the novel I put out a couple of years ago called A Dangerous Business. Um, in the 1850s, if you were a woman, you had to be careful. But if you didn't have some family or husband to rely on, you had to do what you could do.
right,
And so that always fascinated me, and I wanted to explore that with regard to Lidie. And I also wanted to explore it with regard to Annie. So that was part of my that was part of my wish, you might call it.
yeah. I love the way that Lidie describes herself, uh, her plain visage and wayward nature, which she says makes it unlikely she'll find another husband. Is that always how you saw her, plain and
Yes,
wayward?
yes.
That's really wonderful. And it's one of those what is that, 5 words, a 5 word description of a character. I don't know how you could do it better or shorter than
Oh,
that. But no, it's so vivid. It's so vivid, and it sticks in the mind so clearly. You always saw her that way.
yes. I knew that was her reason for being different from the way her relatives wanted her to be. She didn't foresee having the kind of lives that they had, being married, having children. Um, I think in our day, she would be diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
Sure.
But in those days, she was just, to some people, naughty, to other people, disobedient, to other people, you know, um, unworthy.
Yeah. Her quest for knowledge takes on many forms.
Mhm.
Um, of course, through personal experience, which, as you just told us, was a great danger. But she's very well read, and any book within arm's length, she will read and take on.
Well, that's another thing she shares with me. Now, remember, she's only 20. So when I was about her age, I read all kinds of books. I grew up reading the Bobbsey twins and Nancy Drew. And my mom never minded that I would sneak under the covers late at night with the flashlight and keep reading my books because my mom liked books too, or loved books, I should say. So that got me started in always wanting to read something. And then when I was growing up in St. Louis, I went to a high school, private high school called John Burroughs School. And they introduced me to authors that I couldn't understand when I first started out, but got much more interested the more that I read them. We read some works. We always read works by Shakespeare every year, and then but we read Charles Dickens. And the first seventh grade and eighth grade, I didn't understand a word. And then ninth grade, we were assigned David Copperfield, and we had 2 weeks to read it. And because of the first two books, I put it off and put it off and put it off. And then on the Saturday before we were due to have read it, um, I started reading it and I understood it perfectly and I adored it. And that really turned me on to classical literature.
Mm.
So, yeah, I was an avid reader from the beginning, and then I lucked out because I was taught to read other books than just popular fiction.
Yeah. I have this image of your mother allowing you to be naughty and reading under the cover when, in fact, she knew that's what you were doing.
She did know that, but she didn't allow me to be naughty.
Okay, okay.
I had to be respectful, and I always had to say ma'am and sir. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. No, ma'am. No, sir. But I was a good girl.
So, Charles Dickens, very early on, you tell us the story of Charles Dickens will influence the tale. How did you decide to involve him in this story?
Well, he was kind of an obvious person to talk about since he was so popular
Right,
in the UK, and I felt that as soon as Lidie got there, she would read more or be interested in his works because she's already read some of them. So, one of the unfortunate things, I think, from my point of view, is that around the time that she was there, Jane Austen had died and also sort of gone out of fashion. So she didn't get to read any of those books, but she read whatever books she could. And I think that helped her. And Liddy and Annie, excuse me, Anne, once she gets to England, she has to read a lot of plays and understand things. And one of the problems if you're from America is trying to understand the way English people talk and how you would talk if you're going to be an actress in front of English people. And that was something that fascinated me about Anne, what her tasks were and what I mean, I looked up a lot of the history of English theater, and I could see that there was a reason they brought her, and that was because a lot of the theater directors in England wanted female actresses to be more perky and than they thought English women excuse me, and that's
right.
why they came and lured Annie to England.
I was doing a bit of research and I saw that you were raised in about 2.5 hours from Cairo,
Yes.
where Dickinson visited. And let's say he was a harsh judge,
Yeah.
a hotbed of disease, a morass, a grave uncheered by any gleam of promise. When did you first learn about his view of Cairo?
Well, I read I read what he wrote about his trip to America. And so I alluded to that. Because
Yeah.
when I was younger, I loved Dickens. I read all of Dickens' novels. I read his nonfiction. I wrote a little biography of him. And there were biographies of him already, but I wanted to write a short one that seemed to be from his point of view rather than from the point of view of a critic.
So when I came to that section, which is fairly early in the book, I thought to myself, oh, there's going to be some revenge taken here by the citizens of Illinois. And you do something so delicious. Your characters who live in Quincy sort of forgive
Yes,
him by thinking he just made the wrong choice of what town to visit. And,
yes.
and, and you say, and I love this word you chose, that if he had gumption, he would have been pleased elsewhere in the state.
Well, you see, one of the things I love about writing historical fiction is using words that were popular at a particular time. And gumption is one of those.
Yes, yes. But, if he had gone elsewhere, we might not have gotten Martin Chuzzlewit and Mrs. Gamp and
Yeah.
Pecksniff. And so good for us. We lucked
Well,
out.
the other thing I want to say about this is that readers are always critics. So they always want the author to, or not always, but often want the author to have done something a little differently.
Yeah,
And that's what I love about novel writing. You you do it your way, you do the best you can, then it goes out in terms of a book, and then readers have all their own opinions about it. Some people like it and understand it, other people think it's awful. And I love that thing about novels that you are allowed to have your own opinion of somebody else's work because it comes to you and you imagine it your way
yes,
rather than I mean one of the things I remember, so I said before that David Copperfield was the book that I learned to love when I was in ninth grade. And then after I graduated from college and went to England and looked around, I realized what I had pictured when I was reading David Copperfield, which by that time I'd read a couple more times, was not actually what was or what existed. It was what I pictured. And so that's what I like about novels. You see it your way, your friends see it their way, and it's always slightly different from the way the author sees it.
yeah. I have to mention Edgar Smedley, your character, the actor with the Dickensian name and sort of air of modest ridiculousness. What came first, the character or the name?
Well, often when I'm writing, I try, if it's especially in an interesting place like England or St. Louis, I try to use the weirdest names possible. So when I was writing the novel Lucky, which is an alternative biography of myself if I'd been a musician, I knew I had to set it in St. Louis, which I'm very fond of. And I decided I had to use as many weird street names as I possibly could. And so that's why um, Jody, the main character, grows up on Skinker because there's so many weird street names and place names in St. Louis. For a while in my family, I lived in a fancy place called Creve Coeur, which means broken heart.
Yes.
And I just love that about St. Louis. And I also love that about reading 19th century English literature. It taught you things about language. And I just, that was very important to me when I was growing up.
A perfect name like that.
You mean
It,
like Skinker?
Well, Edgar Smedley.
Yeah.
I'm going to use when anybody asks me my name and I don't want to give it, I'm going to say I'm Edgar Smedley.
Well,
It
yeah, and if you look at the various names that English people have from different areas in England, there's so many that are fascinating. Like,
yes,
why was Anthony Trollope called a trollop? And why, why do people get these weird names and then not change them to make them quote unquote more respectable? Because they're fun.
right. They're fun. Um, when you name a character and it fits so perfectly, I find it's either the result of hours of labor and crumpled pages all over the trash can, or an inexplicable flash of inspiration. It just comes to you. Which one was it with Edgar Smedley?
Um, I think it just came to me. One of the things I like to do is look up traditional English names and pick odd ones.
Yeah, yeah,
And so, yes, I think it just came to me.
yeah. And then when it does and it fits, you have to go with it. You have to.
One of the things, let me say one more thing.
Please,
One of
please.
the things, if you're writing a novel, is the names that the characters have to differentiate from all the other characters' names so that the reader can tell them apart.
Right.
And you have to be careful about that. When I was writing The Greenlanders, which I was writing as if it were a translation from Old Norse, I had to be really careful about making the names different from one another because I knew that readers didn't have much, most readers probably didn't have much experience of reading old Icelandic translations. And that's true in every book that I've written. If there are a lot of characters, then I have to be careful about the names.
Yeah.
I'll say one more name thing, and maybe this will
Please.
go into some future autobiography. But I looked up Smiley. This is a fair number of years ago. And most of the Smileys are from southern Scotland, kind of near Glasgow. But the original name before they were Smiley was Smelly.
Oh God.
Isn't that funny? And
Yes.
I thought, so this is why, people get names and then the names change over the years
Yes. Yes. Yes.
because they don't like them anymore.
No. Well, I mean, if your name
Yeah.
was Jane Smiley, I'm not. Well, and we'll see.
Yeah,
Um,
I understand what you're about to.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. So Lidie finds a purpose in Annie's world, and
Mhm.
and we're grateful for that. Um, and it's something like a place between solace and escape.
Yes.
And you mentioned that she reads the Old Curiosity Shop, and how words allow her to imagine a place unlike Kentucky or Quincy. Would you mind if I read a few lines?
Not at all.
Thank you. Thinking of those words and settings let me forget that exactly 2 years ago, the death of my father and the appearance of Thomas Newton were unforeseen, unexpected. The nature of my life then, right here in this room, was simply dreary and dull, and all I looked forward to had been crocuses, and then daffodils, and then lilacs. I knew I had nothing to look forward to now, but I kept reading in order not to think of that. That's just wonderful.
Thank you.
And as someone who I've been reading since early childhood,
Mhm.
it's such a wonderful description of what reading means to us.
Yes, I I think we've been really lucky over the years that the physical nature of books changed so that they weren't incredibly heavy and the print could get a little bit larger so you could read whatever you wanted and you could keep reading and keep reading and keep reading. And
Yeah.
I think that's something that's been really lucky. I wrote a book called 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel. which is about the history of the novel, and then also has two chapters that offer advice about how to write a novel. And I was amazed at the size. It starts with the first one is was written in the year 1000, and then it keeps they get keep getting newer. And I was amazed at the size of some of the books that people had to carry around, that were bound in leather. And I thought, wow, I'm really impressed that they
Right.
were able to do that, and then just keep at it and then write their own book.
You know what that's that I love that passage so much. I read it several times, and before my wife took your book away from me, I had circled it. And maybe this is something to do with getting older as a reader. But yes, that place that books put us in long ago, and how
Mhm.
vividly it can be recalled. I find myself, if I pass my bookshelf and I look at a book, if I want to, I can just be back there, not where I was when I read it, but where the author had me.
Yes.
It's a phenomenal experience.
Yes, I still can picture in my mind some of the things that I thought I saw when I was reading David Copperfield. And that's, 60 years ago.
Yeah,
And I think that's I mean, the bad side of it is that your brain gets so full of memories of these kind of things that it's like too much stuff in the kitchen cabinet.
yeah,
But the good thing about it is that they come back to you and you think, oh, wow, I remember that.
yeah. And someone else 150 years earlier had a similar thought.
Hmm.
It's just a phenomenal thing, and it's incomprehensible, really. It's just so miraculous. By the way, I should add that what I just read appears on page 24 and is the conclusion of chapter one. And a few pages later, we learn that a Mallory Cunningham, who runs a theater company in Liverpool, wants Annie to go to Chicago. Lidie goes with her, and by the way, Cunningham provides funding for her to have a horse and a gun. And so we are well underway. And I admire how much information you parceled out in so few words. And because I knew we were going to speak, I found myself reading very carefully.
Hmm.
And then I thought, no, 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 no. Read at your own pace because all the essence and flavor is there. Absorb it and just go with the story. Do you think about readers when you're writing?
Well, I hope that I have some. And I do have one, a very attentive reader, which is my husband, but he doesn't read the book itself when it's done. After I write something, the next day I read it aloud to him. And then I see things that I missed the previous day. And then he also notices things that maybe I got wrong or that he doesn't understand. And then I fix it. So I would say that my most important reader doesn't read the whole thing except for couple of pages at a time from beginning to end.
I
So,
I,
but
I
it's
had a
important to me to have someone who can help me along day by day.
yeah. I might have phrased that question incorrectly. I once had someone say to me, "Do you write for yourself or do you write for readers?" And I came up through journalism, so I said, "No, I write for readers."
Mhm.
And the person looked astonished when I said that, and she said, "Which one?" As if you could choose a particular reader to write for. Let me
Well,
ask
I
you.
would say that I hope for readers, but the reason I usually write about something is because I'm curious about it.
Mhm.
So I'm my first reader, and I try to discover things, learn things, explore things. and put them on the page, and then hope that first my editor and then my proofreader will actually like it. And then it'll go out to readers who like it. And that's been, since I like to do all different kinds of things, obviously that's had its ups and downs, but that's all right. I I'm the kind of reader who tries all different things, and so I want to try all different things writing also.
You just mentioned something that I was under the impression that you write the kind of books you want to write, that
Yes.
your map is drawn as you go along. Um, Something tremendously free in that and liberating in that, but you have to earn that, Jane, right?
Well, I knew that I had to do my best, but I started out with my own ideas. So when I was growing up, obviously we read a lot of Shakespeare, and he had written tragedy, comedy, and romance. And then I read a lot of Icelandic sagas. So I knew just when I was starting out that I wanted to write a tragedy, a comedy, a romance, and an epic. And so that was my plan when I started out. So I knew that the tragedy would be a rewrite of King Lear.
Mm.
And then but I didn't know how to do it. And then when I lived in Ames, Iowa, we were driving south from Minneapolis and looking at the northern area of Iowa, which is very fertile. And I said, oh, this is where I need to set that Lear book, because I didn't want it to be about a war, but I knew there could be a legal battle.
Mm.
And then when I wanted to write an epic, the problem with the Icelandic sagas was that there wasn't one about the end of Greenland, of the Greenland. And what I learned about Greenland compared to Iceland in the Middle Ages was that the Greenlanders were larger, had better diets because there was so much seafood that was available to them, and they were exploratory.
Mm.
So I wanted to write about the end of the Greenland colony, and then so that was the epic. The comedy was inspired by teaching at Iowa State, a land-grant university, and reading books by David Lodge, who wrote about teaching and was also a comic writer. And so that was Moo. And then the romance, I looked that up, and it turned out that a romance was about exploration as well as love. So that I called my ex-husband and I said to him, because he was an American historian specialist, I said, I'd like to write a book about violence in American history. And the first word out of his mouth was Kansas. And I always joke around and say, if you're from St. Louis, you don't even know where Kansas is. But that's not true. I like Kansas. But I didn't know anything about the Kansas troubles. And then I looked them up, and then I went there and I saw what an interesting place Lawrence was. And I thought, yeah, this is what I have to do. I have to write a book about the 1850s in Kansas, because I hadn't read any other books about that. So, and I wanted it to be from a woman's point of view,
Yeah.
not from a man's point of view. So that's how I ended up with those four. And then I also wanted to write a book about horse racing, which was called Horse Heaven.
Right.
And I decided to have a comic horse, a tragic horse, an epic horse, um, a romantic horse, and then two regular race horses. So they're all race horses with different feeling, different ways of looking at things and different ways of running.
So when you were very early in your career, did the industry try to dissuade you from Pursuing? No.
No, they, the reason I lucked out, and I've told this story a lot of times, but I lucked out because when my first book, which was Barn Blind, was finished, I was able to send it off to a fellow student of mine at the Iowa Writers Workshop who had decided to become an editor rather than a writer. And when she was smart as a tack, and she always did a great job. And when she was working, and I think it was at Harper and Row, her boss was having Freudian therapy every single day.
Oh, Lord.
And and he said to her, he didn't come into the office very often. He said to her, "You can buy whatever you want, just don't pay much for it." And so I sent it to her and she bought it. And the amount she paid paid to us for it was basically the same that we were getting when I was teaching at Iowa State, same yearly salary. So I thought it was a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot.
So I always say that it's really a pleasure and I think a good idea to sort of tiptoe into the literary world, not to have a big blockbuster right off, but to go into the literary world, look around, explore what you can, learn what you can, and then try to go from one book to the next and then keep going.
Uh, I think you alluded to this earlier. Is the third adventure of Lidie what's next for you, or what's coming next from Jane Smiley?
I'm not telling you.
Oh,
Actually, I will tell one thing because I'm interested in this one. Um, not too long ago, I was on a local trail called the River Trail, and there were signs everywhere that said, "Watch out for mountain lions." And so I was walking along the trail in the shade, and I heard this noise, and I thought, "Oh, geez, I felt mountain lions about to attack me." I'll tell you another mountain lion story in about 2 minutes. And then I turned around and it was just a guy, a big sort of bulky guy, a little ways behind me who had slipped and maybe stepped on something. That's what made the noise. And so I didn't feel at all threatened. But when I got home, I thought, okay, I need to write a story about someone who does feel threatened, who's doing the
yes.
same thing I was doing and does feel threatened. But I decided I was going to try it in a new way. Um, I was just going to write about 1,000 words a day, 6 days a week, and see where it went. And so that my next book is called The Trail, and that's the book. And
Oh
I
my goodness.
and I really enjoyed it because I would read what I'd written the day before, but I still didn't have a plan. So what my pleasure was coming up with an idea, working that one out, and then keep continuing to come up with ideas. Um, but I will say that the only time I ever experienced an actual mountain lion was maybe a year ago when I was sitting in the hot tub and a mountain lion ran up the stairs to the deck. I saw it coming, and then it ran across the deck and up the hill.
Oh my.
I, I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel any fear at the moment because it was running. I thought it was fearful. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't know what I would do if it came over toward me, but it didn't. It just ran up the hill.
Yeah. I want one more reference to Lidie. You leave us with such a beautiful and hopeful ending. Um, and when you have a tragic figure like Lidie, um, it is a rare experience for the reader to get to see the character recover and
Well,
regain hope.
yes, but she's young. So if she wants to continue to have a life, she has to understand how to, and especially in the time when she's alive, she has to understand how to recover. And that's what the book is about. It's about how Lidie recovers from what happened to her in the previous volume and how Annie learns about all the things she needs to know in order to have her career. So I wanted the two things to coordinate with one another. That Lidie helps Annie and watches Annie, and also that Annie relies on Lidie and then becomes independent.
My guest is Jane Smiley, honored author whose latest, Lidie, The Further Travels and Adventures of Lidie Newton, is a delightful and deeply engaging work that settles in nicely among her other outstanding and memorable works. Jane, thanks so much for joining me on Writers at Work.
Thank you very much for having me.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.